So we're gonna transition now from all of the things and all of the needs and all of the requirements that need to happen to some of the things that are being built and deployed and adopted, so that we can build infrastructure and develop and produce or deliver the curriculums that we're working on. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Is really the goal of this panel is basically to highlight the various types of tools and technologies and, that are being rapidly deployed in the context of reacting to COVID. There's lots of practical implications. There's also a lot of concerns about things being done in haste and perhaps with unintended consequences. So we need to chat a little bit about, some of the data that's being collected, those kinds of things. So we have a diverse panel today of people with very different perspectives. We have Dan from the Linux Foundation. They're working with a wide array of vendors and technologies, so that he has a great vantage point from a lot of the technologies that are being built. And then joining us today, we've heard mention of Zoom throughout today's conference. We're all on Zoom. Zoom is the latest verb that's entered the English language. To Zoom, we Zoom, we've been Zoomed, Zoomland. And so it'd be interesting to hear how they've reacted to the influx in demand and how they see their product being deployed. And then lastly, we have a researcher who focuses on data and how can data be managed, how should it be managed, what's responsible use of data. And so I'd like to introduce each of them. So Dan Kohn is the general manager of the Linux Foundation. He leads the new foundation that was just released, the Public Health Initiative. He's got a history as an entrepreneur and been in the tech sector a very long time. Julia Stoyanovich is the assistant professor at NYU in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the Tandon School of Engineering, and she's part of the Center for Data Science. And again, she focuses on responsible data management and analysis practices. And lastly, Tain Barzso from, I hope I pronounced that right, sorry, Tain. He's the product lead for education at Zoom. He is a university instructor, so he understands what's going on in the classroom. He's a veteran educational technologist. He's recently joined Zoom to lead their development in the sector. He works closely with educators to build the management for in-person, online, and sort of the hybrid blended courseware disciplines that we've heard so much about today. So with that, I'd like to start with you, Dan. If you could share your observations on the kinds of things that you've seen that have emerged, what's exciting, what seems to be getting some traction. If you could share a case study where you can walk us through a little bit, perhaps on where a particular technology or new tool or new app is beginning to be deployed.
Sure. Well, before we talk about any new technology, I do think it's important to look at what public health authorities have been doing for hundreds of years, which is testing, tracing, and isolating. And all of that does use technology. And unfortunately, we've now found that our public health authorities have had a radical level of underinvestment over the last couple decades in particular. And a huge number of companies are stepping up and individuals, and there's major investments being made. But I think we're all aware of the fact that the US is particularly behind on this, and that we need to improve all three of those capabilities in order to get this virus under control. So when we look at kind of new approaches that are being tried, it's really in the context of trying to make those traditional approaches work better. And perhaps the newest area that there's the most optimism for is called exposure notification. And this is based on an approach that Google and Apple have collaborated to make available and to build into the operating systems in their devices. And so this exposure notification system is very much focused around privacy protection. It doesn't keep track of who you are. It doesn't keep track of who you're interacting with. It doesn't look at location at all. But it is a way that as you are interacting and going about your day, that your phone in the background can essentially have handshakes with people around you, and that they can that your phone keeps track of any other phone that it's been around for more than 5 minutes. And so if you sit on a park bench next to someone, or a bus or subway. I should also emphasize that the exposure notification system that they put together is entirely opt-in. So both you and the people that your phone is talking to have to opt into it. But then the key idea is that when, if later on one of those people gets a positive diagnosis, they can enter a code into their phone, and all of the people that they've interacted with over the previous 4 days receive this exposure notification and knows that they may have been exposed and that they need to get tested. So this has been rolled out in about 11 countries so far, and maybe the most promising to date has been in Ireland. They deployed the app just 3 weeks ago, and in the first week, more than 1/3 of the adults in the country have downloaded the app. And I know that you're going to have Kian, the CEO of Nearform, that did the development of that on this event right after us. So I'll leave it to him to talk more about that. But there's also been over 100 exposure notifications that have been detected so far. And so potentially each of those are people who might not have known otherwise they were exposed, that might have gone days more as asymptomatic carriers and could have been passing on the virus, and instead are hopefully self-quarantining and getting tested, and we're cutting off those events early. So Canada is right on the verge of rolling out their own app that's based on code developed by Shopify. And our hope and expectation is that you're going to see the 50 US states each roll out their own app, hopefully over the next few months. So over a dozen of them are now in progress at different levels of development. So I would say that it's taken longer than we would have hoped, but I do think that this app can be a useful tool in the overall toolkit that can then help the contact tracing we were talking about before become more effective.
Terrific. Tain, Zoom was thrust into the public spotlight. You know, I personally have been using it for quite some time. I know a lot of people have, but when this pandemic hit, I mean, your usage scaled in a way that I don't think you ever could have imagined. Share with us a little bit about, you know, you're focused on education. You know, NYU adopted it day one. We literally went overnight from teaching in the classroom to teaching virtually, as have, you know, so many other schools around the country, around the world. Share what that was like internally, how you reacted. I know you had some internal early criticism and had to react to it. And I think you've done, as an outside observer, I think you've done quite well at reacting to your growth. But what was it like on the inside, and where do you see it going?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I can speak a little bit to where I see it going, and I can definitely bring up questions. So I've been here for about 6 weeks. I'm actually very fresh to Zoom. So I wasn't on the inside when sort of the big bang happened, but I have been here for sort of the aftershocks and the sort of, okay, now that the dust is settled, you know, where are we going? You know, it was a really powerful push. They took 90 days, and their focus was 100% on security. They said, we're shutting down all development. We're putting all of our energy and all of our power into this. And right now that's still happening. So, you know, definitely kudos to them for being extremely reactive and trying to make the right thing happen. You know, it was definitely a company that had been founded for helping the enterprise do video conferencing with those tools. And then all of a sudden we had millions of brand new users. And it's like, okay, now what do we do? Well, this is great, but you know, and so I do think there's a really powerful internal motivation to help, which is fantastic. That's my feeling, again, being here as a relative outsider and now as an insider after being here for a short period of time. You know, it's interesting. So having been brought on to help improve the platform for education, I've been focusing on a few really key areas, right? And those are engagement, this idea of hybrid and what does that mean? And along with that, I think come really big issues of equity and equality and accessibility for video and education as a whole, and then potentially synchronous and asynchronous education and how those can help with some of those issues. So for example, one of my North Star really was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education that I read some time ago. And it was talking about this issue of schools being thrust into emergency teaching mode. It's like, oh my gosh, you know, you now have to do everything online. How do you do it? You've chosen a tool, go, right? But that's not necessarily true online education. And the question is, how do we shift over that? How do we look at different modalities, right? And, you know, certainly there's some graduate schools and business programs that have been doing that. There are a number of exec ed programs that have been doing these sort of blended programs, but we now expect all schools from K through 12 and higher ed to just do this by the thousands with instructors who may not be trained to this, who are doing most of the prep work 100% for free, just out of their own passion, right? As a company, I feel that we really need to create tools that build engagement, and we need to be able to help instructors customize and really have a sense of control and order over what they're doing. I mean, I work for Zoom. I'm on Zoom meetings all day, and I'll be the first one to say that I have Zoom fatigue, right? Anything that's over 30 minutes, you can feel the attention span wandering. It's perfectly normal, right? And I get that. You know, we need to understand that video isn't just a one-way tool. I think that helps, and that's what engagement is, right? You know, when it comes to education, how do we remove total focus from the teacher? How do we get away from the sage on a stage model? How can we create collaboration? You know, within Zoom, we're looking strongly at breakout rooms so students can collaborate and actually work together in pods. How do we do things like improve audio for things like music education? We can't look at just individual use cases. How can we make that richer? We have to ask questions about what is it assessment? What is testing? What is proctoring in this entirely new environment? How do we serve that? But then also, how do we help maybe flip that completely on its head? It may have a completely different new meaning. So yes, we want to find ways to at least come to equal with the in-classroom experience, but we also want to find ways to even improve it. When we come to hybrid, you know, we have this new paradigm. I'm not going to say new normal because I think that term is kind of overused. I think it has negative connotations as well. But hybrid is the big term right now, but we don't know what it's going to look like. And this is where I think equity and equality really come into play. I visited a private school here in the Bay Area, and they are able to say, oh, sure, we're doing a hybrid model. Here's our classroom. We're able to have 6 feet in between each student. The instructor is up at the front of the room in kind of a goalie box with a face shield. We have a $3,000 device that allows us to talk to 2 or 3 students who are, you know, far away. And that works great for them, but how about a public school with a 30-to-1 student-teacher ratio? How about parents who can't be at home with students, rural areas, people with bad internet, can't afford the technology? We need to find ways to address as many of these use cases and socioeconomic backgrounds and just different cases as much as possible, because we need to also understand that teachers are doing twice the work in a hybrid education setting. It's not just some are there, some are here. You're doing a lot more. How can we help make that a more seamless experience, right? Reduce that tool fatigue, keep you from switching back and forth. I don't have a full answer for it, but these are things that we're considering and that we're taking in. You know, hybrid's a challenge. We need to reduce that friction. I do think after this current crisis, people are going to want to come back together, but there'll still be a very strong place for video because hopefully we will have found places where it is still as good, or maybe it can even improve upon that. And then finally, this last piece I was talking about, this idea of synchronous and asynchronous. I mean, right now we can ask this question of how do we capture those in-between moments, right? The ones where we're not in scheduled meetings, you know, the unplanned life, you know, the workplace being just happening before and after meetings, water cooler conversations, schoolyard conversations. That's one question. How do we do that outside of that structure of meeting? Certainly we can ask, do we want to connect all of those, right? Do we want to always be connected? And I think that's completely valid, but there is a lot of value there. And again, it can come back to that issue of equity. So I think we need to think about how do we open it up more? You know, we can talk about doing things like opening up chat channels and letting students talk back and forth. But I think when we first think about this idea, the first thing that pops up is, oh, these chat channels will go bad, right? It's not being moderated. What are students going to do? You know, where are these private video channels and all these things going to end up? Does it have to do that? But the big question to that is, are we always on? Or do we want to go to the other direction, right? Do we completely rely on synchronous technologies like Zoom or whatever your technology that you choose to use is? Or do we say, well, maybe we're not always on. Maybe we start looking towards the asynchronous. very briefly, and I'll wrap up here, but I had a conversation with a recent Georgetown undergrad, just a graduate. We were talking about technologies, and he was talking about how texting completely disrupted email and the phone call, how email is sort of the tool of his grandparents, which I thought was interesting because I use email. But then the question is, what would end up disrupting video communication as well? And what could take the place of at least some of it? And I think we need to be open to disrupting ourselves. That might be a dangerous thing to say, but is there a place for those small bites, these small pieces of video where you can record something, you can send it to somebody else, you can capture it in different times, you can overcome some of those accessibility issues. And I think while some would say, oh, is this the TikTokization of education? I also think it's important to look at how students want to learn and how they want to ingest. And is it all in one big 30-minute chunk with a lot of technology, or can it be these small pieces? So these are some of the places we've certainly been looking, and these are areas that we're trying to develop towards, and we're certainly open to as much input as we can possibly take from educators across the board. So.
Terrific. That's all. You've got a big job on your hands. There's a big spotlight on you, and as an educator, as my mother is on Zoom, I hope you do well. But you've touched on a bunch of things that I think leads into Julia, which is, proctoring, assessing, always being on. You add that to some of the discussion earlier today about health monitoring. So there's a lot of discussion about data being collected in a lot of different ways, not just, in the classroom, but lots of the things in terms of mitigating the spread. And so Julia, I'm sure that you've given some thought to, as an educator, as looking at the use of data management and all of the things that are being collected. What kind of guidance would you give? What should, the audience is largely, educators. What should they be thinking about in terms of avoiding unintended consequences and violating people's privacy and worrying about security issues?
Thank you, Andy, for this introductory set of questions. I will speak more as a researcher and less as an educator, although, of course, many of these questions and many of these issues that Tain mentioned in particular are of great interest to me, right? How do we actually do assessment? And how do we encourage participation when we teach over Zoom? But what I would like to share with you today is more about just essentially thoughts on data collection, the sharing of data and data analysis as we are preparing to reopen. And what does it mean for us to do this responsibly so that we can reopen in a responsible manner without losing the trust of all the folks whose data we're collecting and using, right? So I think that broadly speaking, we need to consider three aspects here. And these are in no particular order, but let me just give an order to them. So the first I'd say is ensuring the safety of everyone who does come to campus. The second is that as we collect this data, we need to also be cognizant of the rights and the preferences of different kinds of individuals, of students, educators, administrators, support staff, as they pertain to their own data and their own engagement and participation modalities. So meaning that we should give people control over what data we collect of them, how we use that data, and how they engage, whether it's in person or online or in some hybrid mode. And the third is that with both of these concerns in mind, safety and accommodating preferences of individuals, we need to create systems that are efficient and effective at meeting these goals. So we should not just be spinning our wheels, right? We should be doing things that make sense to achieve our safety, efficiency, and legal compliance and ethics goals, essentially. And in all of this, we're reasoning under uncertainty, both collectively as a society, as an institution, but also individually. And this, of course, makes things very, very difficult, right? Both operationally and in terms of the kinds of value judgments that we make and the ethical choices that we make. So I like to think about data collection, sharing, and analysis in terms of the benefits and the risks that they induce, and further thinking about who reaps the benefits and who shoulders the risks. We must be very careful as we do this to ensure that the risks are not borne disproportionately by some subpopulations and that the benefits are not reaped disproportionately by some other subpopulations. And this, of course, is not new, right? It's just these days, it's essentially something that we have to think about thoughtfully, quickly, and these issues are on steroids. And there is, of course, a rich history of imbalance of power in society that then translates into disparities in this context, in this risk-benefit context. And many of these historical examples are in the public health domain. Some stark examples are the Tuskegee syphilis study, where all the risks were borne by one population, and that was a disadvantaged population that could not fight back. One example was also brought up today by one of the students on the previous panel, by Justin, who spoke about how individuals with disabilities experience online learning very differently, and they have very different needs for in-person instruction. And so their evaluation of the risks and benefits for themselves may be different than that of other populations. And this thinking generally about who bears the risks and who reaps the benefits links closely with the notion that I think should underlie all of our work on designing and operating these complex socio, legal, technical systems that are based on data. And that is the notion of equity, as already Tain mentioned, and in particular here, we like to call this data equity, just to instantiate it a little bit. As we know, even in the best of circumstances, underlying structural inequities in access to healthcare, to employment, to housing show up in the data record. And then when we use that data, these inequities are propagated through decision systems that may be automated or may not be automated to become reinforced in actions, in policy. And under the current regime of haste, we not only risk reinforcing existing structural benefits, but we also risk introducing and normalizing new inequities. For example, those that would arise if we are not thoughtful about whether we do contact tracing and how we do contact tracing. Or if we're not thoughtful about, for example, the use of certificates of immunity, if those become the norm, right? So there are grave risks here. Importantly, though, as is underscored by the pandemic, there are also significant risks associated with not collecting and not sharing data. If we don't know how the disease is evolving, then we have no way at all to try and control it, its spread. Further, if we don't know how the disease and its spread is affecting different communities, whether these effects are disparate, then we have no chance of mitigating those inequities either. So as difficult as these topics are, we must engage with them. And we have to do this in a nuanced and productive way that will allow us to act, but not act as a kind of a blunt instrument that reinforces these inequities that we've been seeing historically. So more concretely here, we have at our disposal very different modalities of data collection, of data sharing and use that are appropriate for different scenarios. So as a very simple example, let's suppose that our goal is to help schedule when people can use elevators or access a lab or access a classroom. So at NYU, the use of elevators is a very important question because many of our classrooms are on the 9th floor, on the 10th floor. There's no way to get there by using stairs, right? So if we want to collect data to help inform, when a person can or cannot use an elevator, then all we need to collect is just counts. No personally identifiable information. How many people are in an elevator or in a lab or in a classroom at a given time? And participating in data collection brings an immediate benefit to the data subject, to the person, right? Because if they pitch in, if they give their count, then they can know when to use the elevator. And further, because this data collection is arguably something that gives us data sets that are not sensitive, they're just counts, or less sensitive, we can afford to share these aggregated counts, adding some noise to them perhaps, with something like the differential privacy frameworks to help us schedule things more globally, efficiently, like schedule not just this one elevator, but schedule the flow of people to elevators on the university campus. So this is one example where, again, the benefits are immediate, the risks are low, and there is an opportunity to share this data. One interesting trade-off in this case is how we should strike this balance between the level of privacy that we afford to individuals versus how correct the counts actually are. One modality here is to collect data and then add some noise to it already at the individual level. And we can do this with tools that are within the local differential privacy frameworks. So when you yourself report that you're taking an elevator, I will, in expectation, yes, I will record you as a count of 1, but there's going to be some noise there. So sometimes you will come up as 0. And that would mean that we would know approximately how many people are in an elevator at any given time, but then we would not compromise any one individual. Another modality is to collect data from individuals precisely, but then before we share it for these global analysis tasks, we could be adding noise at that step. So these are trade-offs on which we can decide. As another example, if our goal is to collect sufficient information about people who are in the same room at the same time, and this room could be an elevator or a lab or a classroom, for example, to be able to contain a future outbreak, then we do need to record who specifically enters and leaves the room and at what time. This information is, of course, sensitive. It's potentially compromising. And it's important to limit the sharing of this information. In other words, only to share it on a need-to-know basis with specific accountability structures in place, allowing us to audit who accesses the information, when, and for what purpose. We should also be sure to destroy the detailed records and to keep only the aggregate counts when the usefulness of the records expires. Another thing to consider is that we may need to only keep records for folks who are in a room for longer than some specified period of time. For example, because we may know that fewer than 10 minutes of exposure is not really dangerous exposure if it's a well-ventilated room, and if people are wearing face masks. As a final example, we may ask ourselves whether it's worthwhile to implement full-on contact tracing on campus. And to answer this question, we should again ask, what would we gain from this data collection? To whom are the risks? And what benefit do we derive from this collectively? Do we really need to be collecting such fine-grained information? And my current point of view, and I'd be interested to be convinced otherwise, is that we actually should not be doing this, because I think that the benefits that we derive are minimal compared to the kinds of benefits we could get by just recording who enters what room, yet the risks are tremendous. And in the case of NYU, for example, the reason for this particularly is that very few people are on campus all the time. People take the train to get to campus, so there's a lot of stuff that happens externally that we are not going to be able to capture with these very fine-grained contact tracing apps, like handshakes between phones that Dan spoke about earlier. And yet again, the risk of compromising privacy is quite grave there. This is something that we should be discussing, but at the moment, this is my thoughts on this particular modality. And so I would not personally be in favor of such a solution. Another crucial ingredient here in really deciding on these trade-offs is allowing people to opt out of data collection and sharing, while at the same time enabling them to productively participate in university life, even if they opt out. This means that we should meaningfully support remote participation in courses and support meaningful social interactions between the students, even if they're not in person, without requiring them to be on campus. And so when they're opting out of data collection, they're at the same time opting out of in-person engagement, but this doesn't mean that we are disallowing them to be students, to participate. So broadening this concept of the campus community, as was remarked by Jordan, a student on the previous panel, I think is really what is important here, to come as a complement to this opt-out and informed consent, really. So in summary, my recommendation is to work, for all of us, to work very hard, but also very quickly, to identify data collection, sharing, and analysis solutions that bring tangible benefits, and where we can have a handle on the risks and a handle on understanding of which populations bear the risks and who reaps the benefits. When we develop these approaches, we should be in close contact and consultation with the people whose data we're about to collect, to understand their opinion on the benefits and the risks, and more generally, to create an environment of trust in which these data collection, sharing, and analysis efforts are seen as something that is constructive rather than a sinister social experiment. So this should be something that is a productive approach where we all come together and where we use technology and data to help us productively reopen. That's all I want to say for now.
Okay. Thank you, Julia. That was quite a lot for everybody to think about. I have the unfortunate position of having to wanting to moderate this panel and ask a ton of questions, and also having to guide the entire event to back to timely closure. So unfortunately, I am going to have to let's do one quick round. Julie covered a lot of things real fast. One was that risk-benefit trade-off of contact tracing and exposure notification. Dan, I know that you have been thinking a lot about how to mitigate some of those issues. You've got a really interesting framework in the dashboard about how all of the companies have to, publish things on, open source, all those sorts of things, so that people know what's going on. Can you sort of give us 1 minute about what people are doing to mitigate some of the risks that Julia highlighted?
Oh, absolutely. And I will just paste in a URL here. This is the Linux Foundation Public Health COVID-19 response. We call it a landscape. It lets you look at what all of the countries and states are doing in different open source and closed source projects and products. But I'd say that the biggest thing that can be done is by not collecting any data in the first place, you avoid the risk of accidentally or inappropriately disclosing it. And so I do think that this exposure notification framework from Google and Apple has the best opportunity to get really ubiquitous deployment, both in the US and around the world, and to significantly cut back on, to be able to warn people when they have been exposed. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I love it that we have an actual panel here where there is some healthy degree of disagreement, right? So not collecting data, right? Not collecting data, sure, that's the safest thing, but we can't not collect data. We actually have to collect the data that allows us to do things that we need to do, like to mitigate the risks of exposure, to make sure that we're not discriminating against people from low-income backgrounds. So I think we must collect to show accountability, right? The question is, how do we share and how do we use it?
That's a really good point, Julia. And I would make a strong distinction between universities on campuses and employers that may need a lot more data versus what the public health authority on behalf of the government can and should be collecting. And I think there's going to be a wide divergence between those.
And then another thing, just to follow up, is who is to decide, right? So I think that it should not be these entities of authority that decide. We do need to give people a voice.
I think you're in agreement on opt-in. So with that, I do have to bring this panel to a close to get back on schedule. I want to thank you all for making the time today. Terrific conversation. Tain, it was terrific to hear what Zoom is, what you're thinking, where you're going. And Dan, this dashboard is terrific. I know you didn't call it a dashboard, the leaderboard is great. And Julia, clearly there's more knowledge there than most people can soak up in a few minutes. So thank you again for making the time.